Now, I know I had an article about a professor, but this right here, it gets really crazy because now we're going into Rachel Dolezal 2.0 highlights a very specific type of white female privilege. Because, after you saw the documentary, if you all have Netflix, or, there was the documentary of Rachel Dolezal, you would have thought, we won't have this again. But unbeknownst to us, we did have it again. But this person went so far as to even lie in their relationships and pretend all through her tenure of working as a professor that she was actually a black female. So Rachel Dolezal 2.0 highlights a very specific type of white female privilege by Robin Autry. Okay, so I found this article pretty interesting because of the title, but I know what it's going to be talking about. So it says, identities are tricky. They can be assigned to us, and sometimes we assert them, but they are socially constructed, but they're not entirely fictive. So just ask Jessica Krug, okay? Or is it Jess La Bombalera? Which one? Which name? So let's get into this. And for those of you that are just coming on board trying to figure this out, this is about a professor who was teaching at George Washington University. And let's get into this article. So, her name is Jessica Krug. Or maybe her name is Jess La Bombalera. Or is it? Or ask her students and colleagues in the history department at George Washington University. So Krug set the internet ablaze last week when she seemingly confessed by way of a post on Medium that she had assumed an identity, okay? Let's get into the identity that she assumed. So the identity that she assumed within blackness, okay? I assumed identities within blackness I had no right to claim, is what she said. She labels herself a coward, a liar, the refuse of non-black society, and a cultural leech. So she felt conviction. She felt like she needed to clear the air and admit that she had been living a lie. But ultimately, she positions herself as a truth teller, confessing her wrongdoings. So her nationality is a white Jewish woman from the suburbs of Kansas City, posing as a North African and then sometimes an Afro Latina. So I gaslight you, or I gaslit you, she wrote. So, in what is meant to sound more remorseful than triumphant. So she basically is clearing the air and she's basically admitting to her wrongdoings. She even admitted into one previous article that I read that she had some mental issues. Now, she actually is clearing the air because she said she had been living this fictitious life. So she suggests that we cancel her as a punishment, after explaining that cancel culture is a righteous tool of those with less power to wield against those with more power. And so in the end, we might agree with Roxanne Gay that Krug confessed impersonation amounts to her, or her confessed impersonation amounts to little more than an absurd display of selfish flagellation, hardly worth mentioning during a pandemic and widespread social and economic unrest. So yet, how can we account for the media frenzy swirling around it? So what is it about a white woman desiring access to an imagined black experience and then being exposed for the lie? That continues to fascinate. Okay, so it is a new twist on a now familiar tearful display of a white person compelled to confront their own racism. So it's hard to look away when those with white privilege or with the privilege flex their power, okay? And while simultaneously throwing up their hands and saying they are being vulnerable. So this is the power of privilege. The power to opt in and out of identities, to dramatically defend or chastise yourself before the viewing public, and the power to redirect virtually every media outlet to your far-fetched story. Rachel Dolezal wasn't the first, and Jessica Krug won't be the last. And so that's the unfortunate thing with this. What I want to say is, how many black women can pretend to be white women? You know, unless we somehow, if we have features that we can assumingly pass for that type of role. And some of us can. There are some that can. But I have not really noticed. Well, there was one time I noticed a woman that she claimed white, and I knew she wasn't white. And she was telling her kids that they're white, and I knew they weren't white either. The kids were more biracial, but the woman was black. But she was really very, how would you say, she could pass. If someone really wasn't really paying attention, she could pass for white. But I knew she wasn't white. So I think maybe she had, in her lifetime, went through an experience that was negative, and so she just accepted that role because that was what she looked more to someone who didn't really know any better. That was what she could assume herself as. But I felt that there was a lot of pain and there was a lot of confusion with that. This is another scenario. But most times, black women, you don't have, if they're brown skin or dark skin, they don't necessarily go out of their way to assume the role of a white woman unless they really know that they could, be in that position where they could fool someone, like maybe pass. But this right here, for white women to be so bold enough to say I'm black, there's a lot more than just the hairstyles and even beyond this the skin complexion. It's the life that we live as Black females. Doesn't come easy. And for someone who is born into a set of experiences that they are afforded more opportunities versus someone who has opportunities that are very little, it strikes me as odd that a person can treat a situation like that like a light switch where you can turn it on and then turn it off. One minute you can live this life of privilege, and then the next minute you can live another life assuming that you're marginalized or you're minority in a minority group class. And that's really puzzling to me that somebody can flip that switch on and off like that. And so Krug's alleged confession, which is all we have to go on, because Krug herself has not commented publicly since the post publication, is thoughtful, but if not melodramatic, unlike the dizzying remarks of Dolezal 5 years ago. So Dolezal, she is an NAACP chapter president in Spokane, Washington, or at least she was. And she had her whiteness exposed by her own family. Her mother and father revealed that she actually was in fact white, and she denied it. So in contrast, Krug is right to call out her power, although we still don't know why she chose this moment to act. And so it's very possible, as some have alleged, that Krug's admission was more self-serving than she seems to imply. And so this, for those of you to jog your memory, this is Rachel Dolezal right here. And so she says that she's trans Black, meaning she's a white woman, but she feels more like she has the identities of a Black woman. You know, she was born a white woman, but she assumes the identity of a Black woman. And so,
Rachel, thank you so much for coming back and speaking with me. Got to meet you almost 2 years ago now.
Right.
And you have a new book, In Full Color, Finding My Place in a Black and White World. So why, after everything, do you still identify as Black?
Yeah, well, I wrote the book really to encourage and advance the conversation about race, and yes, to set the record straight about my whole life story, and also to just really encourage people to be exactly who they are. And the essential essence of who I am is best defined in culture and race terms as Black.
I know last time, I think the term transracial, trans-Black was discussed.
Right.
How do you define, do those terms come into the way you define yourself?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there are too few people that we don't have a vocabulary to really express racial fluidity. So, but I do like the term trans-Black that Melissa Harris Perry suggested, because it does kind of cover the I wasn't born this way, but this is who I really am component. But transracial, I think, is just, it almost sounds like I'm neutral. And I'm not neutral on political and social issues.
And there are other white women who are fighting for social justice, who are raising children of color. Do you think you could have been more effective as an ally? Instead of as a Black woman?
Right. I really believe that we each need to just be true to ourselves, and that's the best path, like to be true to your, who you are. And so, I mean, like I said, I tried the ally path in my earlier young adulthood, and because I felt like I was obligated by everybody else's definitions to really assert that this is how I was born, this is therefore who I am. I felt kind of faded to that, and I did a lot of work, but it wasn't as much in harmony with me being seen and understood for who I am.
You're in a unique position because you grew up white, lived as a white woman. You are now you identify as Black. How can you help white people?
Right. Well, I think it's undisputed that there's still a lot of favor towards people who identify as white in Western societies, and there's still a stranglehold on power and privilege by white people. And I hope that my book challenges that. I mean, I got a lot of opposition from people who are very tightly, very closely, and very kind of consciously aware of aligning with white supremacy ideals, and they, have accused me of committing white genocide and all these kind of things. It's like I'm ending the white bloodline in my family, and I'm kind of like butchering the idea of white beauty. We all need to really have the courage to confront our own convictions and understand what we're saying and why.
And so you can be kind of a unique, kind of liaison, I guess.
Yeah, kind of a bridge. I mean, I do kind of feel somewhat caught in between a little bit because I kind of like a ping pong ball, getting slapped from both sides. I guess that's, maybe useful for people to have something to bat around a little bit, because people do want to talk about race. I mean, it's something that we don't talk about enough in substantive ways.
You chose a new name. How did you come to choose this new Nigerian name as your new moniker?
It was actually given to me. So I think that it's unfortunately the press said that I chose it randomly, which I didn't. At the end of the book, in that blog, I discuss that an Igbo man reached out to me and really just said that, like, we see you, my tribe sees you for who you are, and you have this high frequency Nubian soul, and you're incarnated to this white envelope, and you were brought here as a gift from the gods to challenge white supremacy spiritually.
I'll say now that is a protest that is going on, and that is happening in Times Square in New York City. That was Thursday night, and that was Black Lives Matter protesters. And there was a protest where a car drove through the protesters in Times Square. And so that's what that was about. And so, but our article is about Rachel Dolezal and Jessica Krug. And so, like Dolezal, Krug altered her appearance, darkened her blonde hair, according to a family friend, and seemed to take on an acceptance speech. I said acceptance speech, but an accented speech. So she had kind of tweaked her accent so she could sound more as if she was maybe Afro Latino, Afro Latina, or Black. And so to perform her version of a Puerto Rican Blackness, which that's where the name earlier in the article, is it Jessica Krug or Jess La Bombalera, a grittier activist version of her academic self. And so those were the personifications that she was, the character that she was living. So also like Dolezal, she was drawn to an Africana studies in college, and so eventually earning her doctorate in African history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison before earning a tenure at GWU. And her estranged family, like Dolezal, is not playing along, revealing to CNN that she's as white as Snow White. And so basically, parents, people who really know these people are coming out and speaking out to basically expose who they really are, birthwise. So, as I read about Krug's educational background in an article from the Chronicle of Higher Education, which also linked an archived CV, I was struck by a number of parallels. So, I also earned my doctorate at UW Madison, and her graduate advisor served on a dissertation committee. So, also like Krug, I was drawn into academia after completing the Ronald E. McNair Scholars Program as an undergrad. So later, we were both awarded an Advanced Opportunity Fellowship to support our graduate studies at UW Madison. So both of these academic programs are designed to increase the presence of historically underrepresented groups in higher education, including students from marginalized communities who are of low income or the first in their family to attend college. So we both benefited from these programs, and we're now both tenured professors. But unlike Jessica Krug, I am black. And so I have never met Krug, but I have encountered characters like her on college campuses, including my own. So they share some uneasiness with their whiteness and seek refuge in their fantasies of blackness and the rich culture. History, and especially the radical politics that they associate with it. But there is a world of difference between appreciating a culture or aligning with it politically and insisting you somehow embody it. So, even more that you might do so better than other black people because you are, as Krug had been described in her author bio, an unrepentant and unreformed child of the hood. Okay, so when I read the Medium post, it struck me as less a confession and more of a shield. So the author insists that it is neither, but now, correct me if I'm wrong about the name, it's Harry Zayed, the writer and the editor in chief of Bait or Baiter, tweeted, and it has an R. So if you can see, so I don't know if that's what they wanted to put, if that's the meaning. So she didn't do it out of benevolence. She did it because she had been found out. So originally what I had read in another article about Jessica Krug is that she was a professor at um, George Washington University. And for years, she went under this assumed identity of a black woman or a black Afro Latina. And she had even changed her name. Even in her relationship, she admitted that she had went under that identity. And so for years, she lived like that. And, I guess only the people that might have been, you know, from her family or closest to her may have known. But from what it was said, a lot of people were not really aware. There was some that felt kind of like something wasn't right about her. I've heard that in the other article that there were some people that were wondering about her. But then there were other people who just didn't know. And she had went on for years and years and years like this. And now look at what we're going through right now. There's a pandemic, a lot of social unrest is going on, a lot of things that are going on in society, social upheavals of having to do with racial divides, even in politics, so it goes deep. And so now all of a sudden, this professor at a university decides to come clean after so many years of not telling her students, not telling her relationships, that her intimate relationships, it sound like maybe dates, and not telling her fellow colleagues the truth that she actually is in fact a white Jewish woman that comes from the suburbs, and that she assumed an identity of being a black woman fictitiously for many, many years. And so they're basically kind of paralleling and comparing the two, Rachel Dolezal's situation to this woman's situation. And yet this one, it looks as though they're trying to say, should we have empathy for this woman because she came out and she told the truth herself? But however, the truth was about to unfold and it was about to be exposed, so she went ahead and exposed herself before she was exposed. And so with Rachel Dolezal was exposed by her own parents. And so she had assumed this identity for years as being this light complexion black female. And she was working with the NAACP, which, a lot of people were not really aware of what was all going on. That whole thing, when that whole thing came out to the open, there was a lot in Netflix documentary, if you would want to look at that documentary that led up to her being exposed. And so now going back to this article, it says she had been found out. So similarly, Yomari Figueroa, professor of African Diaspora Studies and African American and African Studies at Michigan State University, tweeted that two senior black Latina scholars had looked into Krug's past. So they investigated, they did their own little investigation and were ready to expose her because they knew something was not right. It was off. So anthropologist Yarimar Bonilla, reflecting on her time with Krug as fellows at the Schomburg Center for Research and Black Culture in Harlem, New York City, described her identity play as tantamount to a minstrel show. Wow. That does not sound good at all when I hear that. But Krug seems to have effectively asserted herself as a fraud rather than being assigned the label. So, this is a new phase of American whiteness, a complex history, and an uncertain future. And so, I don't know what all's involved in here, but I will go back up to it when I get towards the end of this article because this sounds pretty interesting. So while Jessica Krug's name has gone viral, most of us don't know this person by any name or identity. So by all accounts, her scholarship is impressive. Her recent book about a circulation of revolutionary ideas among enslaved people during the transatlantic slave trade was a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize and Harriet Tubman Prize presented at Yale University and the New York Public Library, respectively. Yet now, George Washington University, GWU, as the Washington Post reported, is investigating Krug's revelation. that her very existence is based on, as she wrote, "The napalm toxic soil of lies." Wow, that is deep, deep. As the university looks into the situation, Krug has been removed from her African and Latin American history courses this semester. So, what does lying about who you are mean for an academic, let alone an activist? Lying about your whole identity, your whole life of who you are. So we all mislead and withhold certain aspects of ourselves to win friends and influence others, but if not out of basic politeness. But that's not equivalent to crafting a sprawling imagery world to prop up a persona that animates professional and activist work. As with Rachel Dolezal, assumed identities can cause harm. That's especially true when the identity is assumed in order to create professional and cultural cred. So Krug's references her disassociation from the identities that she was assigned at birth. She's white, Jewish, Midwesterner, and she also mentions unspecified childhood traumas that prompted her to seek refuge in false identities and offers these unaddressed mental health demons as the primary explanation for the fakery. Although she's also chalks it up to cowardice. Krug never actually apologizes or pinpoints what it is about whiteness and Jewish culture that made her want to shed both in favor of a black life she used as a righteous tool. Yet, she also assures her readers, her confessors, that her personal mental health conditions and past traumas do not exonerate her. Ultimately, Krug's assurances and the confession itself read like an instruction. So comfortable in her role as professor, she manages what information is presented in which order and how it should be contextualized through discourses around trauma and abuse, mental health, anti-black violence, restorative justice, and cancel culture. So even if we accept this teacher pupil construction, every good student pushes back. So, and as we push back against this neatly prescribed narrative, we might also consider what it is about white femininity that keeps producing this phenomenon. Wow. Perhaps it is a twisted attempt to be seen and heard, even to misbehave, by defying expectations of good white girls and women. So rather than confronting those expectations directly, to masquerade as the oppressed is to seek out greater rewards beyond those of whiteness itself. More social media followers, more credibility, more access to spaces and initiatives reserved for people who have been historically marginalized, including college admissions. Wow, that is deep. You get more social attention, more media, everybody's looking at you. It makes a lot of sense. But in this platform, why would you do this? Is the big question. And so before we shrug and move on to the next spectacle, we might take a moment to consider what about our society, our institutions, that produces and craves such imposters while simultaneously ignoring and erasing other, more complex portrayals of blackness. Wow. that this article says a lot. So let's go back up to this right here and find out what it says here.
What's happened since the spring and summer of 2020 in the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and protests is that millions of white Americans are waking up to their whiteness and being puzzled.
A summer of protest has launched myriad conversations on blackness and what it means to be a black person living in America. But whiteness also has its own history in the US, one that author Nell Painter says deserves just as much scrutiny.
Because for so much of American history, being white, being protected as white, being praised as white, has been a large part of our national culture. People who are white don't necessarily see that.
There is no one definition of whiteness, but if you want to look at where the history begins, we have to go back to the 18th century Enlightenment, when the concept of race as we know it first emerged.
Scholars became taxonomists, in which they categorized everything in the world, including animals and trees and birds, people.
During this period, Enlightenment scholars started to classify humans into races based on physical characteristics. One of the most prominent classifications came from a German physician named Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who based his taxonomy on the dimensions of human skulls and ordered them into a hierarchy according to his aesthetic preferences.
So for him, there were 5 varieties of mankind. He realized, on the one hand, that there were no clear lines, that there were intermediate populations throughout, but at the same time, he made a categorization in which there were clear lines.
In the middle was his most beautiful skull, the one of a Georgian woman native to the South Caucasus, who later inspired the label Caucasian. On either side were the Native American and the Malayan, and on the very ends were the African and the Asian, skulls Blumenbach considered the most ugly.
So Blumenbach's book, which became one of the foundations of physical anthropology, is full of contradictory statements. When I was writing the history of white people, my editor wanted me to speak of pseudoscience when I talked about race, but it wasn't pseudoscience, it was impeccable science of its time. Blumenbach was a real professor at a real university, a very prestigious university, a very prestigious scientist, but that science has not stood the test of time.
Through the 19th and 20th centuries, definitions of whiteness continued to change, though there has never been an agreement on how many races exist or how that's defined.
So, for instance, in Boston, the presence of the Irish in the 19th century, poor Irish, they would have been considered a race. There were many white races, according to science of the 19th century.
It wasn't until the 1940s that the idea of one unified white race emerged, after the Nazis declared Jews a separate race from Aryans.
The anti-Semitism of Nazi Germany really shook up many Americans because it was like what many Americans thought. Henry Ford, for instance, was a big anti-Semite. So at that point, also coming out of the Great Depression and then into the Second World War and the need for national unity, anthropologists who were the experts at the time told us that there were 3 real races. They were Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Negroid, in that order. And within those groups, everybody was the same.
That idea still exists today, but because of an influx of immigrants to the US after the 1965 Immigration Act, those racial categories are still changing.
Since 1965 and since heavy Hispanic or Latino immigration, we now have, since 2000, 2 categories of Americans. One is racial, so you're black, white, and then the other races are actually places like Asian, Uh, and then we have ethnicity. So you are or you aren't Hispanic or Latino. So you have two choices now.
Those categories are changing even now, in the aftermath of the George Floyd protests.
The two sides that I saw in how white Americans think about their race is on one side, not really having a racial identity, being an individual. And then on the other side, having a strong racial identity, which is superior white race. And that would be white nationalists, white supremacists, which the vast majority of white Americans didn't want to be associated with. So, what I see changing now, there's a big space for people who are understanding that they are raised as white people and aren't quite sure what it means and are learning about it. So we're entering a new phase of American whiteness.
Is that how cowboys wear them? Over.
So those videos, they were in this article, so they're not my videos. But anyway, what do you think about this phenomenon that is happening now that we have more of this going on? Um, I found it really rather interesting. So, having said that, I'm gonna let this video go. This is more like a discussion piece. So, with having said that, I'm gonna let this video go. Thanks for listening.